Hello friends, I hope this finds you well and enjoying the last few days of our semester. Congratulations, you've almost made it. So today I'm going to be presenting on the Jesuits' arrival in Brazil and focus a little bit on their mission. My research question was the Jesuits' mission to evangelize the Americas an act of violence against the indigenous people? My thesis: the Jesuits' determination to force conversions was an act of violence toward the indigenous people of Brazil. These people already had a religion, so this practice was both dehumanizing and cruel. As way of introduction, in 1549, the King of Portugal launched the first Brazilian Jesuit mission, a Catholic order called the Society of Jesus. It traveled the globe with a mission of evangelization and education, uninvited as they were, and this mission proved incredibly useful to the crown. Their strategy was fairly simple. Now remember, this is a religious order, men of God, trying to share the love of God. Their strategy? Overpower and pacify the indigenous population. Sounds very upstanding. Good stuff. This included the forced recruitment of the population for labor, so slaves, conversion, and instruction. As a way of encouraging communication between the Portuguese visitors and the native people, the Jesuits decided on a standard language, which is a form of Tupi. The Jesuits decided, in a land that was not their own, what the standard language would be, all in the name of their God. I've always been fascinated by what atrocities men commit in the name of their gods, and Latin American history is chock full of such stories. I wanted to know more about these self-proclaimed men of God. So according to Brazil's most famous Jesuit, Antonio Vieira, evangelization was only possible with colonization. The fact that colonization and evangelism are two sides of the same coin is both violent and problematic, or it should have been to the Jesuits. If the choice is convert or die, how can such a conversion be authentic? It was not about faith. It was not about religion. It was not about saving souls. It was about power, control, and greed. I came across this quote in one of the journals that I referenced at the end by Anne McGuinness. The Jesuits found themselves acting as scientists, doctors, healers, administrators, and advisors to kings and viceroys around the world. Recently, historians are writing about how Jesuits interacted with people that comprised their spheres of influence: the indigenous peoples, African slaves, other Europeans, and Protestants. It got me to thinking, maybe they did some good. Maybe they were only mostly bad. So within the colonial arrangement between the crown and the church, or state and church, Christianity slowly began to take root. The Catholic missionary endeavor required support from a state leader and financial backing, and also the willingness of a religious order to carry out the mission. They had both. We're going to look at the Tupi people, basically because I can't look at all the indigenous peoples that they impacted, but this one I found really interesting. The Tupi, when the Jesuits initially discovered or met them, they didn't think they had a religion of any kind, but they did. They had their own religious practices. They practiced elegant preaching in the mornings and evenings. They smoked herbs, entered into trances, and contacted spirits of the gods. They believed prophets could be reincarnated, and they believed in a paradise called land without evil. And sometimes the Tupi even sacrificed their own lives to go to that paradise. That sounds like they had a religion, right? The Jesuits became a military religious order, but that's not how they started out. It was during the 17th and 18th century that they changed to, that they militarized. And this gained the Jesuits a century of measurable success. But it would ultimately lead to the end of the order. When Pope John Paul III gave the formal confirmation of the order, he made these Spanish brethren soldiers of Christ. And originally, I found this really entertaining, their plan was to convert Muslims in the Holy Land, but the Muslims weren't interested. And so their vision shifted to an easier, simpler path, and they decided to seek conversions among the more compliant or conquered people in territories colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese. To accomplish their mission, Jesuits became educators. They established colleges to instruct the future leaders of Catholic Europe, and their zeal also led them to start missions around the Americas. Another good thing that I found that the Jesuits did is that they fought for the Guarani people. So they were in the village when slave hunters came through, and they took up arms to protect these people and keep them from being stolen away. The legacy of the Jesuits' good work does continue today. In colonial Brazil, as in all of Latin America, the Jesuits are remembered as, for their educational endeavors. And every time they started a school, they also built a library. First one was in 1549. The libraries became the center for many private and religious collections that eventually became Brazil's first public libraries. That's a pretty nice legacy. However, there is such a dark side, and the dark side is far darker than the light. The colonial history of Brazil is bound up with the transatlantic slave trade. It is imperative that we understand the victims of colonialism also include Africans who were forcibly removed from their homelands to build in foreign lands. It's important to note that the Jesuits owned slaves. So the violent legacy of the Jesuits continue to this very day. The myth of racial harmony continues, with inequalities in Brazil barely acknowledged. Black Brazilians face adverse conditions, remain disproportionately deprived, they have poor housing, very little access to education, very poor access to any decent health care, and they're being targeted by a police force that is one of the deadliest in the world. Black people also continue to be demonized for this culture of violence despite their conditions being violently imposed. That sounds familiar too, doesn't it? In conclusion, in many ways, very little has changed in terms of the murder and deracinization of indigenous Brazilians, nor has much changed in terms of the anti-black, racist institutions that dehumanize, impoverish, imprison, and murder black Brazilians. Colonial Brazil prides itself on being a racial democracy, but it's a moniker that appears to be nothing more than a cover, an attempt to hide the reality of white supremacy that is historically and deeply entrenched in the fabric of the nation. That sounds familiar too. The Jesuits, regardless of their motives, did far more damage than good and acted violently toward the indigenous people of the lands that had been colonized. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. Be safe, be happy, be well, and if you have any questions, you can email me at the email there in the box. These are my references, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I wish you all very happy holidays, and I hope we all have a much better 2021. Thanks.